Lecture 8 December 8, 1960. You will recall the analysis of the problem of ontological difference which I attempted to present for you earlier. I explained why, in spite of the doctrine that being or the concept of being is allegedly prior to the conceptual and the domain of beings, we actually find that ontological difference is already decided in favor of being in the sense of concept or idea. And I explained the way in which this claim to priority turns out to be unjustified. I should say that, at this point of course, as in all these matters, we discover something of the most tremendous significance, which is that the fundamental division of subject and object which appears as the last word in all congealed or reified thinking cannot actually be the last word at all. And this is something that Kant repeatedly acknowledged in all those passages in the Critique of Pure Reason where he alluded to the need to discover a common root both for the sphere of intuition which is concerned with existing things and for the conceptual sphere of the categories. We have good historical reason for regarding the separation into subject and object, and thereby all the dualisms and rigid antitheses with which consciousness typically likes to work, as something which has actually come to be. We know there have been whole strata of thought in which these dualisms have never occurred. And the difficulties encountered by Western thought in even trying to understand the speculations of the Far East are surely bound up with the fact that Far Eastern thought, and perhaps all non-Occidental thought, is not couched in terms of this dualism, of this fixed structure of subject and object. If this division or separation itself has emerged historically, we have some reason to think it may not be permanent, that this gulf might yet be closed, though it is an open question whether that can only happen once it is closed in reality, once reality is reconciled with itself, or whether philosophy can somehow anticipate this. And it is certainly true that fundamental ontology recognizes something of this. It also has to be said that this realization that dualism should not be regarded as definitive or absolute is precisely what motivated those tendencies of idealist philosophy which often prove most offensive to the contemporary mind. Here I am thinking for example of Schelling's doctrine of intellectual intuition as an immediate unity of subject and object. Or also of Hegel's dialectic insofar as it always takes the object to be subjectively constituted and the subject to be objectively constituted at all levels. And I would just add that the extraordinary influence that has been exercised by fundamental ontology is surely connected with a certain loss of cultural continuity in relation to the philosophical tradition. Or, to put this less grandiously, we could say that certain ideas, like the notion that being somehow has to reach back behind the division between the concept, that which is merely thought, and the concretely material, could come to exert the enormous effect that they have only because, in the general wake of modern Western positivism, earlier philosophies had rather fallen into oblivion beyond the extremely narrow circle of what we like to call professional philosophers, amongst whom this whole problematic is still alive. And it is surely not the least attractive feature of fundamental ontology that it manages to talk about these things without assuming any significant background knowledge. In other words, this ontology acts as if the relevant problematic could be addressed in an immediate fashion if thought simply immerses itself in being and underestimates the historical dimension of all these things in the process. And if I take the view, as I have made emphatically clear in another context, that what is ancient, what is handed down to us from the historical past, can only be understood from the perspective of the substantial and compelling experience of our current situation, then the reverse is certainly also true. In other words, this intensified form of the philosophical problematic that is expressed in the word being can only really be understood, can only amount to more than a kind of verbal magic, when we see how the problematic of philosophy already leads in this direction in terms of its own rigorous and internal logic. And it is also one of the tasks of these lectures to draw your attention to this point and help you to realize its full significance. For it also implies, amongst other things, that certain vulgar objections which have been raised against fundamental ontology and Heidegger in particular, and here I would simply mention Carnap's famous critique as a typical example 1, essentially reflect the charge that this philosophy is unintelligible. Now if we actually take this philosophy as it presents itself in the first instance, and that is what I was alluding to when I spoke of verbal magic here, that is, if we take this philosophy as if it promises in an utterly immediate fashion to reveal certain mysteries purely in and of itself, then we cannot evade this apparent aspect of unintelligibility. In other words, we shall be confronted with a whole pile of concepts with regard to which we no longer know what we are actually supposed to picture or represent to ourselves, to borrow an expression from Hegel's polemic with his contemporaries. But when we really recognize these difficulties in their internal and necessary relationship to the problematic that has been handed down by philosophy, to the continuing process of thought itself, I will not exactly say that we can instantly fulfill, as it were, all of the concepts in question. For where philosophical concepts are concerned, that is often quite impossible. In Kant too there are many concepts where we have to ask what precisely it is that we are supposed to think when we use them. And when we look for whatever it is that corresponds to them, we find again and again that this eludes us. Yet in many cases we also discover that philosophical understanding is not a matter of translating concepts into corresponding facts or states of affairs at all. Rather, it is a question of translating concepts into problems. In other words, it is a matter of realizing what has driven us to formulate a specific concept, of recognizing what is effectively postulated in the formulation of a specific concept, such as, in this case, that of being. And here I would like to help you by attempting, as I tried to do in the last session, to bring a specific historical dimension, in this case the epistemological problematic of phenomenology, into the heart of our discussion of fundamental ontology. Now, after all that I have just explained, you may be tempted to say, well, if you yourself assume the possibility of some such unifying moment, which you have criticized so much in Heidegger, then why don't you actually permit this in Heidegger's case? And I believe the answer to this question, which you have every right to expect, is indeed the central issue here. For we can indeed recognize the limited and provisional, and even illusory, character of a certain intellectual tendency or tradition, such as the dualistic or dichotomous mentality which has existed since antiquity, just as Heidegger has done. Yet since the process which has led to this mentality also has a rigor of its own, we cannot simply conclude from the problems involved in this dualistic separation that, to put it very crudely, we can just try to turn the wheel or the clock back. We can certainly argue that this emphatic opposition, let us say, between material stuffs or substances on the one side and principles on the other, as this was played out in the intellectual labors of the pre-Socratic thinkers, in the archaic hylozoistic philosophies of the Ionians, did actually lead to the loss of something. For the dimension of the numinous, the element of mana, to the all bordering on horror which was experienced in the face of the world as a whole, or however we put it, since these are all rather kitsch expressions, and the fact that we really have no other expressions at our disposal is extremely telling in itself, has effectively been expelled from the world, and this does entail a certain loss. And this loss is registered in Heidegger's expressions about the loss of being and the forgetfulness of being. But this still does not allow us to regress to such archaic theses. Now, of course, if Heidegger were confronted with the claim that we can no longer sustain the idea that the whole world consists essentially of air or water because the natural sciences have taught us otherwise, he would undoubtedly reply that we would thereby simply be misrepresenting the ancient Ionians, such as Anaximenes or Thales, about whom we really know so little. For far from making the kind of claims we associate with the natural sciences, they were saying something about being as that which is allegedly prior to any split between conceptual principle and the particular material character of things. But I would say in response that the change in human consciousness that we associate with the rise of science, and which had already led thinkers in antiquity to postulate something as abstract as the being of Parmenides or the becoming of Heraclitus rather than some material stuff as the most universal principle of all, had made itself felt long before the explicit emergence of developed scientific thinking and had already forced philosophy itself to look for a new principle. And this was simply because the material dimension in the hylozoistic philosophies had shown itself to be limited and limiting, and in a sense capricious, in character. Thus one thinker appealed to water and another to air, while Empedocles invoked all of the four elements, and one could carry on like this in a basically random way. And the arbitrary aspect of all this rightly motivated the really bold and radical speculative minds amongst the ancient philosophers to develop those much more abstract unifying principles which for their part now specifically furnished the model for the concept of being. Now I believe these things are very important if we are to grasp the situation in which this thinking arises. For they reveal that what fundamental ontology treats as if it constituted a kind of ontological fall or original sin is not something that is arbitrarily or externally visited upon being, or the thinking of being, by an intellectual process of reflection, but is something that was motivated by what those concepts essentially touch upon. In other words, if we suffer today from this division, from this rigid separation of dualistically opposed moments, whether we call them subject and object, or conceptuality and actual beings, or however we describe them, if we suffer from such ossified antitheses, and become aware at every step of their own inadequacy, in the inadequate character of the business of science itself, for example, then the possibility of any reconciliation here surely cannot lie in a forced attempt to restore a stage of consciousness that has already effectively been abandoned. Rather, if the distress of this separation continues to be felt, this can only encourage us to think this dualism through to the end, to overcome these rigidly opposed moments by reflection upon the very reflection that has produced them. In terms of the problem we are talking about here, that is precisely what defines the problem of dialectics. And in this connection I have already allowed myself to develop a fundamental line of thought which will show you why it is necessary to contrast dialectical thinking with ontological thinking. I should also add, however, that so far I have indicated only the necessity for thinking dialectically rather than ontologically in a merely formal way, or, we might say, merely in terms of certain philosophical reflections on history. 3 But I have not yet really begun to provide what I promised you at the beginning, something which I certainly intend to do in what follows. For I need to show you precisely how the necessity for dialectical thinking itself arises specifically from the substantive problems and concerns, from the inner problematic, of the philosophy of being. But we can only accomplish this once we have entered into this philosophy much more deeply. And let me just say that being really remains hanging in a rather indefinite relationship to the domain of conceptuality here, for let me remind you once again that being, for reasons I already analyzed in some detail last time, must not be regarded as a being or entity of any kind. Thus in the Introduction to Metaphysics, one of Heidegger's later texts, we read the following on page 31, and although he puts this in a hypothetical fashion here, you will clearly see where this is leading. I could easily have found other more direct textual evidence as well, but now the question is whether the assessment of being as the most universal concept reaches the essence of being, or whether it so misinterprets being from the start that questioning becomes hopeless. The question is whether being can count only as the most universal concept that is unavoidably involved in all particular concepts, or whether being has a completely different essence, and thus is anything but the object of an ontology, if one takes this word in its established meaning. For it is very clear from this formulation that Heidegger certainly inclines to this latter way of putting it, that is, to the idea, as he says, that being has a completely different essence from any concept whatsoever. And right there you actually have the whole aporia that I have tried to present to you as the essence, indeed as the dynamic essence, of this conception of being. For you have now recognized the specific character of this concept of being in both of its aspects. On the one side it cannot signify beings regarded as a whole, cannot simply be taken as an objectification of the is, of existentia. On the other side it is not to be regarded as a concept or as mere universality either. For, in contrast to the realm of conceptuality, it is supposed to enjoy the wealth of significance and the kind of objective character that we generally ascribe only to what actually exists. Thus we see how one side effectively lives off the other here, how one always borrows something from the other, although the debt is never paid back. In other words, it is precisely from beings themselves that the concept being borrows that concreteness, wealth and objective character which concepts otherwise lack, while this moment that is borrowed from beings now borrows in turn from being, thus helping itself to that essential, universally binding and unforfeitable character which contrasts with the contingency of the things that simply exist. Now if these two moments are inseparable, and if in such inseparability this mode of thinking emphatically, deliberately and archaically resists the differentiating movement of thought, this even serves a good functional purpose. For the inseparability of both elements here already means, whenever we try and pin one of them down on either side, that such thinking can always claim that this is not what it meant to say at all, and that we are thereby simply failing to enter the dimension of being in the first place. One is thus secured on every side, and this very inseparability, this lack of articulation, already affords protection to such thinking, allowing it to spurn everything that does not bow to its claims. for the separation into being and beings, into the domain of the conceptual and the domain of beings, which is maintained throughout the history of metaphysics, for which indeed Heidegger shows such disdain, would already open up this concept of being to critique. Critique is actually nothing but a process of distinguishing, a process of confronting different aspects or moments in order to see whether the conceptual moment is genuinely fulfilled in its respective objects, whether it is an empty or a legitimate conceptuality, namely one to which something corresponds, and, on the other hand, it is a confrontation of the realm of beings, of what is there, with the concept. In other words, we must ask, like Hegel, how far something that exists corresponds or answers to its concept, namely whether that which merely exists is actually what it purports to be. This process of distinguishing varying and contrasting aspects or moments is the critical element par excellence. And if Heidegger's philosophy in its entirety is essentially anti-critical, rather in the sense that certain contemporary sociologists describe their orientation as anti-Enlightenment 5, then we can even trace this back to the philological roots of the concept of critique itself. Now I do not actually share Heidegger's fondness for invoking philological considerations in order to elucidate issues supposedly connected with being. And we shall certainly come to my reasons for eschewing this approach in due course. But it is a very remarkable thing, and I cannot resist reminding those of you with a knowledge of Greek in this connection that the etymology of the word critique refers back directly to the idea of separating or distinguishing things, specifically to the verb kappa rho nu epsilon iota nu, krinein. Thus kappa rho nu omega, krino, means I distinguish. And insofar as the thinking of being basically brands such distinguishing thought as the original sin of thinking, it sets its face, even in explicitly philological terms, against critical thinking itself. Indeed, as far as I can see, the concept of critique has no place in Heidegger's philosophy at all. And this particular philological reflection is never pursued in his thought. Thus being is neither tau nu tau alpha, ta onta, the domain of beings themselves, nor that of the concept. When he says in the passage we have just quoted that being has a completely different essence, he certainly does not want us to think that it is some additional third or distinct term. For it is supposedly prior to any and every distinction, in accordance with archaic thought where the distinction of being and beings is not yet reflectively established. Thus being would be a kind of essence in which being and beings are as yet undistinguished. This naive and unreflective character of archaic thought is then equated with what is original and thus also higher in kind. If Heidegger's philosophy actually reveals itself in countless variations as anti-intellectualist in character, and to that extent takes up the legacy of all those irrationalist tendencies in philosophy which have emerged from the most varied quarters, such as Nietzsche, Bergson, Simmel, and Dilthey, this irrationalism or anti-intellectualism itself is also, if I might put it this way, still systematically motivated. In other words, since this philosophy repudiates the separating and distinguishing aspect of thought precisely because, as a function of the intellect or the reflective understanding, it fails to do justice to the concept of being, the devaluation of this dimension inevitably leads to the devaluation of the very capacity for making such distinctions. And if the concept of being manages to elude any closer definition or determination through its various infinitely elaborate techniques of defense and avoidance, and thereby also any real confrontation with the question regarding the truth or falsity of any pronouncements about being, we also discover on the subjective side a corresponding deformation of the kind of approach which is capable of drawing such distinctions. Yet there is an exceedingly high price to be paid for all this. And it is exceedingly high even when measured immanently in terms of this philosophy itself. For the determinations which correspond to this substrate or this absolute, and I believe that the expression absolute, drawn of course from German idealism, is still the best word of all to capture what is ultimately at issue here, or, rather, the way in which this substrate or absolute is effectively exempted from any determination, something which would merely limit it or prevent it from being absolute at all, leads only to its complete impoverishment. In other words, it can lead only to what I already intimated to you earlier when I said we end up with something which in an emphatic sense can no longer actually be thought at all. And indeed the highly elaborate and sophisticated apologetic techniques developed by this kind of thinking reveal only how it lends this poverty and indeterminacy a certain dignity of its own. Thus, in the letter on humanism, Heidegger talks expressly about how thought must descend into the poverty of its provisional essence 6, as if the poverty in question were the fruit of a salutary renunciation by which thought might escape every merely reified, superficial and illusory conceptual determination in order one day, perhaps, in the monastic cell to which it has withdrawn, to recover its earlier abundance, even if this very recovery is then always postponed indefinitely. But what is so troubling here is just that this promise, the promise that being will discover that abundance within itself only once it has endured this poverty, remains unfulfilled. And indeed it must remain unfulfilled, for every attempt actually to determine this being on one side or the other would only compromise it, either through contamination with conceptuality or through contamination with beings themselves, which is also unacceptable. I would like to take this opportunity of warning you about something in particular, both in your academic work and in your intellectual life more generally, and this not just in the context of fundamental ontology but also in the immediately contrasted realm of the special or positive sciences. What I mean is that you should beware when people defer everything and say that what really matters about something is not what it has achieved so far but what it will surely accomplish one day. I believe that, whenever you encounter a postponement of this kind, you will find that certain aporias or structural impossibilities that are already prescribed by the matter in question are simply being cosmetically disguised, that what cannot be accomplished by virtue of the matter in question is simply being put off to the future. Thus in empirical sociology we are constantly assured that we must naturally go out and gather an enormous amount of average material data, of an average conceptual level, but that finally, once we have spent long enough gathering it, we might just arrive at a theory of society. 7 It is basically very similar to the poverty of being into which thought must allegedly withdraw if it is to partake, God knows how, in the undiminished abundance of being. Now precisely that approach which presumes to piece society together from innumerable individual observations and the way they are classified cannot actually get to the concept of society at all, for it already excludes the idea that there is such a thing as a concept of society. Now it is characteristic of this whole way of thinking that it makes a virtue out of necessity. In other words, precisely what thought has failed to accomplish, the defects and negative features that it involves, everything that it cannot resolve, all of this, in an extremely bold and clever move, is now reinterpreted as if it were actually a higher form of positivity. We might almost say, from this point of view, that fundamental ontology is a parody of the dialectic, for it pursues a kind of positive negation in the sense that, if this philosophy is deficient or lacking in something, this very lack becomes a mark of distinction, becomes something positive and, above all, even an emblem of higher dignity. The abstractness to which being is aporetically condemned is stylized and transmuted through the supposedly concrete character of this monastic life of thought as if it represented some greater immediacy and proximity with respect to what authentically is. Let me simply add to these preliminary observations something that I may in principle have mentioned earlier. And we are now rapidly reaching the end of these observations before we proceed to an analysis of what I call the ontological need-ate, but which can be expressed again more precisely at this point. I mean that, in spite of that return to the origin which Heideggerian thought claims to accomplish, it cannot actually escape its own historical situation, in other words, that the very reflection in terms of subjectivity which it presumes to overcome as an immediate proclamation from the heart of being nonetheless still makes itself felt in its own method and mode of thought. And in fact Heidegger has not really attempted to deny this. Here I would merely draw your attention to two decisive categories at work in this philosophy where this is rather evident. In the first place I am referring to the analysis of the meaning of words, which, precisely as intentio obliqua, implies reference to the realm of consciousness. For the meanings of words also always necessarily involve something which is subjectively instilled in them, and, by pursuing the philosophy of language as emphatically as Heidegger does, the idea of a speaker is also necessarily implied here. Heidegger is driven to grant absolute significance to language as such precisely because he has to abolish by force this moment of subjective reflection that creeps into his own philosophy at the hands of language. And that is precisely what leads him simply to hypostasize language, in other words, to say that being speaks directly and immediately in language itself without being mediated by human beings. And the second way in which subjectivity comes into play is the preeminent position accorded to man. Heidegger expresses this in the letter on humanism by saying that being is illuminated in man, and that man is the clearing of being '9. This ultimately suggests the old and quite traditional philosophical claim that everything that exists is inevitably mediated by consciousness. And this mediation here appears as the self-illumination of the matter itself. But once again we are presented with a kind of trick, since the character of subjectivity is itself interpreted as if it were something objective and is now, in a certain sense, thrust back into being. This subjective character is thus turned into a determination of being, and being is reflected within itself in terms of that moment we otherwise describe as subjectivity. And here, of course, is where we encounter a difficulty within this philosophy, for the ontological interest which, as I have tried to explain for you, is basically objectively directed, and I specifically use this word here, although it would certainly be offensive to Heidegger, is actually incompatible with subjective reflection itself. And insofar as we can talk of a history of Heidegger's philosophy, it consists precisely in the way that these subjective moments, which in being and time still appear emphatically and almost independently, with recourse to Kierkegaard and others, in the concept of existentials in contrast with categories, now increasingly begin to withdraw into being itself, so that subjectivity itself is subordinated to this objectifying tendency. When Heidegger says that his original intention had always been essentially ontological in character, that is certainly quite true. What he effectively undertook to do can be seen only as an attempt to take up that moment of reflection and subjectivity which is directly opposed to the ontological approach and integrate it into his original project by turning it into a mode of objectivity, turning existence into a synthesis, or mode of being, that belongs to essence, that belongs to being itself. This fundamental tendency of Heidegger's, which I have already talked about and about which I shall have more to say in our next session, consists in turning a defect into an advantage, in trying to address and overcome a basic philosophical problem by a particular kind of conceptual sleight of hand which makes it impossible to draw the required distinctions. We might also express this fundamental tendency in this way: if archaic thought never actually separated the ontic and the ontological, Heidegger now finds that his own concept of being is fashioned in such a way that, without separating these dimensions either, it also harbors ontic moments. For we cannot ultimately make any ontological claim at all, not even the later Heidegger's rather impoverished claims with regard to being, without ontic modes of speech cropping up in one form or another. Thus Heidegger's famous formulation that talks about man as the shepherd of being *10 is an ontic mode of speech. In other words, the attempt to capture something of primordial metaphysical significance here takes us back to primitive pre-agrarian conditions of a cattle-rearing society, and thus to something that belongs very much to the realm of beings and the temporal historical world. Shepherds, as we know, have essentially disappeared, and even in the Black Forest one would now be very hard put to discover one. The whole fundamental structure that underlies this thinking, which you will recognize when you read these things with an alert and critical eye and attempt to withstand their fascinating appeal, if they can still exert such an appeal, is effectively always fashioned in accordance with a certain schema or model. And indeed with most of the theories which have proved so influential in the world we actually find, as Schopenhauer admitted with regard to himself, 11 that they really involve only one thought, and this single thought or single motif is then endlessly repeated. And this endless repetition, this constant self-advertisement, which is also of course the secret of commercial advertising, seems to be what sustains the influence and effectiveness of these claims. The fundamental structure we find here consists in the constant and repeated ontologization of the ontic moment, which we cannot evade whenever we try and determine being or articulate the ontological in an emphatic sense. In other words, the ontic itself is turned into a way of being ontic, beings themselves are turned into a mode of being that belongs to being. And this tendency to ontologize the ontic, to take Dasein and facticity itself, which represents a universal structure, and use it precisely to resolve everything factical into the relevant conceptuality and universality, this is actually the trick, the universal procedure, of this kind of thinking. And once you have really seen through this approach, once you have inured yourself against it, I believe that the compelling fascination of such things will ultimately evaporate. Lecture 9. December 13, 1960. Ladies and gentlemen, in our last session I had begun to say something about that basic structure of fundamental ontology which, along with its general method, seems to me to justify the critical approach we need to adopt in relation to it. I am referring to that aspect which I provisionally described as the ontologization of the ontic. And this structure, as I pointed out, permeates the whole of Heidegger's philosophy and that of his followers. The trick, as it were, of this entire philosophy basically operates as follows. We are confronted with an opposition between the concept and the non-conceptual dimension which every concept tries to grasp.